Hello everyone, welcome to this special session on the new report on climate impacts at work. My name is Lauren Rickards. I'm a professor at RMIT University, where I lead the cross-disciplinary platform on urban futures and the Climate Resilience Living Lab. It's my great pleasure to be with you here today. Let me start by acknowledging that I'm coming from the lands of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to thank and acknowledge them for their ongoing work to care for the unceded country across this continent. So we're here to talk about a really, really important topic. In fact, the intersection, the collision, if you like, between two very important topics, which are, of course, climate change in all its complexity and work in all of its complexity. So the stimulus for today is a report that my colleagues and I have had the privilege of working on, and we'll throw up some slides now to start working through what we're going to be discussing today. So first of all, I'd like to just give you a little bit of a snapshot of where this is coming from, and then I'm going to throw to my dear colleague Anna Langford from Friends of the Earth, who is going to explain some of the genesis of this very interesting collaboration and project that we've been able to do. So the work that this is part of is a project called Climate Impacts at Work, which has come about through a collaboration between the Climate Resilience Living Lab, Friends of the Earth and 6 unions, as we'll discuss. So as I said, today we're going to give you some background and context, talk about the report a little bit, and then hear perspectives from 2 of our unions, and then throw to you for any questions. So please do think about what you'd like to know, what you'd like to ask for, some discussion around, and throw those questions into the Q&A. I'm sure everybody is familiar with the technology these days, but if you do have any questions, you, well, try to sing out in the Q&A, but if not, reach out in other ways. So just quickly, the Climate Resilience Living Lab that I mentioned is funded by the Victorian government through the Victorian Higher Education State Investment Fund. And we've been lucky to work with colleagues in something called the Integrated Climate Platform. And this is one part of it, which is looking at this question of climate resilience through the idea of a living lab or a real world lab, which is the idea that we're in the midst of a real world experiment and we need to pay particular attention to what's going on around us. As we did that, and as we drew across our own experience as well as our expertise across these topics, we really started to identify a rather large and significant gap in some of the discussions to date around climate change adaptation. So that stems, first of all, from an understanding of impacts. Now, everybody here is on the climate changed planet. We're all part of this involuntary experiment of climate change. And what that means is that all of our experiences are now part of an impacted context. When we do that, I'm sure people here would recognise that our work, that is our capacity to do purposeful activities, often paid, sometimes not, but that work is part of what's being affected. It's one of the roots of impacts. And in particular, that means that us as individuals, as workers, people who perform work of all sorts, from, all sorts of different industries and sectors, all sorts of levels, our capacity to do that is part of what is being affected by this climate change context. What that means is that we actually need to think a lot more thoroughly, in a lot more detail, about the ways in which impacts are manifesting in society. We've got a fairly strong handle on some aspects of it, including some of the sort of direct bodily impacts we'll talk about today, but there's this increasingly complex entwinement of a whole range of pervasive pathways that we also need to deal with if we are to adequately adapt. And the last thing to sort of note in terms of our sort of conceptual framework in the Climate Resilience Living Lab is that we very much appreciate adaptation as a form of work, both in terms of the adaptation of existing work, the work that we're doing, including, you know, the need to, you know, protect that, sometimes to rethink it, and the work of adaptation. The fact that, for example, we're all here on this call, we've taken time out of what are no doubt very busy working lives, personal lives, to be here, and just being here to discuss this is an example of the sorts of work of adaptation. So with that short context, I'd like to now throw across to Anna Langford, who's going to tell you a little bit about how this project came about. Thanks, Anna.
Awesome, thanks, Lauren. Sorry, just to check, can you hear me? It was, yeah. Oh, sorry, it was taking a moment to unmute. Yeah, so it's really exciting to bring everyone together after we launched this project nearly a year ago now. And originally we were planning to launch it kind of closer to before the federal election earlier this year. But yeah, it's happening now in a very different context, federal government wise, among other things. And so hopefully with yeah, more fruit to bear from launching it in terms of the outcomes that we might see. So I guess, like, to step back and give a bit of context as to how this came about, Friends of the Earth, which I am a climate justice campaigner at, has a long history of working with the union movement in Australia since we formed as an organisation in the 1970s, and that goes right back to, you know, the early days of when we had a group called Environmentalists for Full Employment, right to this decade, which has seen work such as our campaigning for increased renewable energy production, really including emphasis on the need for renewables projects and the energy transformation in general to not just lower emissions, but create good jobs and be good for communities in the long run. And of course, for a while now, the climate justice work carried out by both the environment and union movements has really centred on the energy transition required to exit fossil fuels and the workers who will be affected by that major economic change. But for the last few years, Friends of the Earth has been working on the new frontline of communities who are already facing the impacts of climate change around the country, and particularly in Victoria. And we're doing this work, you know, still to make the case for the more urgent cutting of emissions, but also to start the now equally important discussion around adaptation, as Lauren has mentioned. In 2022, we're definitely already seeing how the impacts of the climate crisis are wreaking havoc with communities. And I think it's interesting that, you know, maybe up until the last few years, a lot of people I've met have told me that they think they can't comment really on climate change with authority because they're not scientists or economists. But now that we're seeing climate change and its impacts very much here and now, we all already have personal stories of it. And one way that we've all experienced it is in our workplaces to one degree or another. So last year, that came to us initiating this Climate Impacts at Work research project with RMIT University and 6 Victorian unions. And really the aim of the project is we were seeking to draw out workers' local knowledge of climate impacts and to also gather their ideas for the climate solutions, both mitigation and adaptation, that they want to see, which really centre workers' justice overall. And it's been really fascinating to see through the research and through the quite big diversity of workplaces involved through the unions, how quite differently climate change looks on the ground for, say, transport workers compared with health workers and even people across different regions of Victoria, which is part of what we looked into in the research, that very regional, local level. And yeah, the results, as Lauren and Todd will go into, just brought up a whole wealth of experiences which we're only just starting to understand as they're evolving, from health workers' anxiety about not just themselves but their clients when climate disasters happen, to what hospo workers have to deal with when heat waves hit. So it's been a really, really exciting and enriching collaboration and project to do with RMIT and the unions. And yeah, I think it really just has emphasised further that climate action is core union business, and we're excited to continue working with the union movement to further climate justice that centres workers' justice in all solutions. And I really just want to acknowledge the huge amount of work by Todd and Lauren to synthesise the findings of the survey that we put out to the 6 unions and bring this report into fruition. It's just incredibly exciting to know that, you know, we've created this what is a lot of ways world-leading research, and yeah, it just wouldn't have been possible without you two. So huge thank you to you for all your work on it, and I'll throw back to you, Lauren.
Thanks, Anna, and a huge thanks to you for being the main facilitator here. So, look, just to give you a little bit of background, so one of the reasons why we jumped at this opportunity to help do this piece of work was really about, I guess, putting into practice some of the empirical data collection that I feel is really needed, stemming from a lot of my research, but, you know, I just reflect here, summarised in a recent report from the IPCC from Working Group 2 called the 6th Assessment Report. Not a very exciting title, but some pretty exciting content, I promise you, which points to just the seriousness of the issue and the complexities of what we're facing with adaptation. Next slide, please. And so, you know, as we summarised in a conversation piece, recognising that most people would prefer 800-word essay on it rather than the actual chapter, we got to the nub of it, which is to say, you know, what we're seeing now are these cascading and compounding impacts and risks, including the collision between often the long tail, the recovery periods of extremes, as well as ongoing other non-climatic pressures as well. And all of this is placing even greater pressure on our ability to respond. Now, that ability to respond includes the work of adaptation. And as we go on to say, the work of adaptation has begun, but unfortunately, the progress is uneven and insufficient given the risks that we face. So this great experience of being part of this IPCC authorship group really focused my mind on this question of the work of adaptation and the ways in which impacts are themselves being experienced via work, via the effects on workers. So if you can just bear with me for one more, just to kind of explain just a little bit more the sort of conceptual thinking behind this. One of the things this does is that emphasises the synergies between adaptation and mitigation. And so I really want to just state up front that this focus on the question of impacts, this focus of adaptation, is by no means any kind of competition, if you like, with the extremely urgent and primary work of greenhouse gas mitigation. The thing is that decarbonising society at the rate we need to do is hard work. And that means we need to protect the capacity to work if we're going to do that. You know, that is an extra burden upon the work system already, a system that's already starting to buckle under the impacts of climate change. At the same time, if we don't successfully decarbonise rapidly and deeply, then adaptation won't be sufficient and won't be effective. So that's the kind of synergies we see there. And just another thing to quickly emphasise is that by climate change impacts, you know, it really is, as I said at the very start, about this collision between the climatic changes and their multiple flow-on effects and existing contexts, existing systems, existing activities and people, including work. And so it's when we put those together that you actually get the impacts. What that means is that what we call non-climatic vulnerabilities, basically all the other stuff that's going on, are part of the impact equation. They're part of the impact sandwich, if you like. And so that points, when you look at all of this, it points to a whole range of different ways in which we can adapt to reduce climate change impacts, including fixing existing problems. So we'll come back to that, but just to kind of give you that as a little bit of a conceptual kind of snapshot. So what do we already know? Like previous, regardless of this particular work, if we go on to the next slide, please, what's the existing research tell us about some of this stuff? Well, it points to a huge array of really serious impacts to us, usually framed, you will have sort of noticed this in the media and reading you might have done around this, usually framing us or speaking to us as residents of communities, residents of cities, settlements, often as homeowners. As a kind of smaller conversation around tenants, but often it's about property effects. But all of this is to say that it's not directly addressing people as workers. At the same time, there's kind of a less human-centric conversation around climate change impacts focused on assets, of which houses are just one sort, infrastructure, supply chains, as well as particular sectors and resources such as water and food, and of course natural environments. And all of this kind of gets and sort of circles around this question of the intersecting ways in which we bring these things together to achieve things, that is to work, but it doesn't directly address the topic. So that's why we really wanted to sort of jump into the middle of this space. Next slide, please. And when we do that, when we get down to work and focus particularly on workers, we find it a really, really rich lens through which to analyse climate change impacts, because workers are at the heart of a number of different, petals, if you like, or points of the triangle. So we have, of course, the kind of chunking up, if you like, of workers into teams, units, organisations, and from there industries and sectors. And that is another one of the conversations around which impacts and adaptation is often held. Then also workers are, of course, members of neighbourhoods, communities, regions, and that's part of it as well. And it also gives us insight into that more personal domestic side of life as well, as we'll talk about with some of the data, into the effects on families, households, peers, etc. So it's a rich lens, and it's not in competition with these other lenses, but it's a complement to them, and I think provides something a little bit new. Next slide, please. And when we think about workers, there is actually some really important existing research on this that it's important to acknowledge. And a lot of that has focused on the very important question of the direct impacts, particularly of the climatic challenge, which is excessive heat. So that heat is increasing both in terms of average temperatures, and we know that, including increased nighttime temperatures, which means that we don't cool as quickly, which means we carry that heat in our body. So over extended heat, hot periods become more and more distressed. And of course, particularly on those who don't have the cover of indoor spaces. So there's been a particular focus, legitimately so, on outdoor workers. At the same time, there's focus on those whose work is particularly directly involved in responding often to climatic extremes and related disasters, so first responders. And as Anna indicated, there's also a very strong focus on workers over in the greenhouse gas mitigation or transition space as well. And something sort of, there's also emerging stuff around the climate emergency. All of this is really, really important context and stuff that we hope to complement with the approach that we're taking. Next slide, please. But I guess what we see is a need for a kind of more worker-focused, specifically intentional analysis of what's unfolding on the ground. And that means actually talking to workers directly, if you like. It means that we need to look away, escape from the kind of bounds of organisations or communities, and just look at workers as involved in this cross-cutting question of work, getting into the detail of workers' experiences. And when we do that, we realise that methodologically we need to access workers in a way that's not actually quite very common in the research world. And so that's why we're so pleased to have had the opportunity to work with unions who are able to access members across industries, across organisations in this way. This is their bread and butter. And so it's been an honour to work with these particular unions, the Australian Services Union, Community and Public Sector Union, the Health and Community Union, the Services Union, Health and Community Services, extra dot point there, Hospo Voice, Rail, Tram and Bus Union, and of course the Retail and Fast Food Workers Union. So we really are grateful for their assistance in distributing the survey to their members so that we could actually take this much needed look into workers' direct experiences. So with that, I'd like to now hand over to my colleague, Dr. Todd Denham, who's part of our Climate Resilience Living Lab, to take you through some of the results. Thanks, Todd.
Thanks, Lauren. And so I guess I thought I'd start off with some of the key snapshots. So what is the survey telling us? First of all, that climate is impacting on workers' health. 75% of the workers included in the survey said that some health impacts had occurred to them. And 48% also said they'd had their mental health impacted. There was work impacting on workers' hours and roles. There were additional hours due to events, which included both having to fill in for people who couldn't come to work, as well as having to work extra hours to deal with events, increased types of roles, different types of roles they had to fill. And also, although at a much lesser number, some had lost wages and some had lost their jobs due to climate. Other impacts in the workplace included staffing disruptions, as I mentioned before, and 50% had to deal with agitated clients and customers, and 43% had to manage blackouts at work, all as a result of what they saw as climate impacts on their work. And they also had impacts on the workplace, beyond the workplace, sorry. 45% had been unable to get to work because of transport. Sorry, that's a different slide. 45% had to manage transport disruptions as part of their work. More than a third had not been able to travel to work. And we've all had days when we know that the trains have cancelled because of rail buckles and things like that. And also, interestingly, some had reported that because of their work, having to visit people in their homes had created problems in people in housing that was not suited for overly hot conditions as well. So, but when we think about these effects and we think about the unions that were included in the survey, it provides, I guess, insights into the types of work that are not usually connected with climate change and climate effects. So unions, a high representation of unions like the Australian Services Union and the Community and Public Sector Union and the Health and Community Services Union, these people are professional, I guess, under the Australian Bureau of Statistics classification, professional workers and community personal service workers, people who work indoors and not necessarily in the kind of physically arduous work like construction, where a lot of the previous research on things like heat effects have taken place. So while this indicates that the survey results are somewhat skewed and not representative of the Victorian workforce or the Australian workforce, it indicates that the climate impacts on work are widespread because they are going into areas that were not traditionally considered to be impacted on work. So for a bit more detail, if we look at the impact of climate on health by the percentage of time workers were spending outdoors, we see that while most of across all of the impacts listed here, outdoor workers were affected more, but still things like reduction in sleep quality, tiredness and fatigue, and reduced productivity were all above 40% for people who are spending at least half of their working day indoors. But also, you know, we can't sort of downplay the results for outdoor workers, where more than half also were experiencing extreme sweating and reduced productivity and tiredness and fatigue as a result of climate events. Also concerning, although at a much lower rate, was the increased incidence of workplace injury, particularly the 20% reporting for workers who are spending more than half their time outdoors. So across that list of 10, 12 effects in the previous slide, you can see a high average number of effects were reported by different types of workers. Most over 4% for workers who you would consider most susceptible to climate effects, like machinery operators and drivers and labourers. Of course, they're quite small numbers in the survey, but also community and personal service workers who were talking about the difficulties in travelling around to do their work and to attend clients in extreme weather conditions. And other indoor workers like sales workers who, of course, you don't necessarily, I guess, connect to these types of issues, but you can see if the quote on this slide about someone who is working in hot conditions, whose work becomes quite unbearable as the temperature rises. So it starts to bring into the story, as I was saying earlier, that the impacts of climate on work are widespread. We can't just consider them as isolated or only occurring to particular types of workers. Of particular concern was the climate impacts on mental health. If we see what people were talking about, when we have over 40% of people indicating that that had some impact on their mental health, predominantly respondents were referring to anxiety and fire and concern for future generations as I guess the climate impacts roll out. Particularly of note is the higher proportion of younger people reporting mental health effects such as anxiety and stress and distress. One thing that was quite clear in the survey results is the ongoing stress and impacts caused by the 2019-2020 bushfires. And you can see they're referred to explicitly in this data in the analysis of the extended responses, where there was more than 20 people referred to them directly, but also fire and smoke as well came up quite frequently. And you can see from the quote on the side, the climate change was actually impacting on the way people were thinking about living their lives in a more than just their work, and in the way that they were thinking about families and the future. So if we think about impacts on work timing, hours and loads, we can see that predominantly most reported was not being able to get to work, as I said before, and that was across most occupations. Interestingly, sales workers reported the highest proportion who had the inability to meet workloads and targets. We saw quite, I guess, a mix of occupations here, and effects such as having to take personal leave was quite frequent among workers, as well as concerning the proportion of people who had lost their jobs. It was 2% overall, but when you think of 1 in 50 workers losing their job due to climate, it indicates the emerging impact of climate change on the workforce. And in workplaces as well, climate change is impacting on workplaces. We see staffing disruptions that I mentioned before, increased difficult behaviour, blackouts, supply chain disruptions. So it's not only workers, but the work they're expected to be undertaking in the workplace, which indicates this is an issue not just for workers and unions, but also that's something that management has to come to terms with as well. As you can see in the quote from one of the respondents on this slide, there was the issue with management trying to deal with the fact that storms are disrupting the workplace more, which is impacting on business revenue and the way the sites are operating. It indicates there's a need to actually think about the way that we deal with these things in a more systemic way, that there's a need for more thought and more planning and regulation and discussion about the impact of climate on workplaces as well as work. And finally, I think where this ends up is that workers are not only being impacted, but they're also incredibly concerned about the impacts of climate change. They're concerned about their families, as I said before, their physical health conditions, their communities, wildlife, more than just themselves. They're worried about particularly extreme heat and bushfires and grass fires as direct effects in their top climatic concerns. But as we can see, they're not only concerned about their work or experiencing climate change at work, they actually are concerned about their futures. So I'll hand back to Lauren to talk about the conclusions.
Great, thank you, Todd. And if people are interested, we can dig into more specific details as well, but we just wanted to give you, I guess, the main highlights and snapshots there. So, you know, the key message around this is that the impacts are here. These are not a question of the future. They're not something that's abstract or intangible. We're talking about real impacts being experienced by workers across industries and sectors today. At the same time, these impacts are very, very complex. Sometimes they're quite ambiguous. There's, you know, it's a real challenge, I guess, to kind of really grasp them analytically. But what we've tried to do is to think this through in terms of the impacts upon individuals, starting from that research base that's looking at direct health impacts on workers, but then start to stretch out to consider some of the other changes going on in workplaces, as well as, of course, some of those that emanate from beyond the workplace. And when we do that, we start to see that the worker lens really allows us to follow people through their lives, you know, follow people through that commute. As a good consultant knows, you always start charging hours the second you leave the house, right? If not the moment you get in the shower. And so this is about understanding that actually, you know, all of that effort that goes into work, you think about all the unpaid work we put into actually being able to do work, all of that is also in contact with the complexity of climatic changes. And for some workers, sometimes that means also the kind of very distributed workplace they may have. So all of us who are working from home, as I am today, are part of the new distributed workplace, but for some that's always been the case. And so it might be building sites, it might be clients' homes, etc. These spaces also need to be considered, not just, for example, the organisational headquarters footprint, which is a fairly sort of classic spatial boundary approach to thinking through organisations and impacts. And then, of course, it's also those distant, long supply chains, long infrastructural networks that we rely on, including in this call here today. And if there were major impacts on the big transmission line, well, this is solar, but you know, if we actually think about the big connections that we rely on to be able to function and work as we are in this call here today, you start to see the very, very spatially and systemically distributed and exposed character of our work and workplaces. Next slide, please. What that means is that you know, we really need to think about our work very much, as I said, as this kind of collision between climatic changes, their flow-on effects, and different circumstances. And when we think about that, what that means is that in terms of work and workers, we need to take into account all of the existing capacities, adaptive capacities, that's the glass half full, but also the glass half empty, those existing vulnerabilities as well. And so this means that questions of insecure work, as well as those more domestic considerations, such as poor quality housing, these are climate change work considerations. These are areas where adaptation could reduce impacts on workers. And so this is a really, really important consideration when it comes to understanding what sort of adaptations are needed. Which brings me to the next slide about what is needed. So clearly across all of this, we need a worker-centric approach, but that needs to be coordinated, not individualistic. We don't want this to slip into some kind of, you know, top-down handoff of responsibility in the way that sometimes the term resilience has been used before in the disaster space. We're not advocating for that in terms of when we say worker-centric. It needs to be coordinated in the sense of actually working together, but not necessarily in the kind of established conventional ways of organisation by organisation, workplace by workplace. I think we can be more creative in what that coordination looks like, which is why working with unions and Friends of the Earth and others and forming some unusual alliances, I think, is really important. When we think about adaptation, we need to look and consider things like the direct climatic conditions and weather conditions being experienced in a given workplace by people at that bodily level. Of course we do, and that's why things like looking at appropriate equipment and uniforms is really important. And one of the sort of stories we heard was about the collision between requirements for full PPE and being able to actually stay cool enough to do work well. And so of course we need to look at that, but we also need to step back and use this adaptation prompt for the positive opportunity that it can be, which is actually to ask the bigger questions, which we're seeing happening in the transition space around the sort of work that we need, the sort of work that serves us and serves society well, the sort of work that we can sustain. So there's some big questions, and what we need to avoid is a knee-jerk approach where adaptation of every workplace and every form of work is the starting point. We need to ask some bigger questions as well. At the same time, there's an opportunity to ask even bigger questions around how we organise, distribute and schedule work. That might be spatially, that might be across workers and populations. We need to ensure that workers have the security and the flexibility that they need to be able to manage climate change, which is to say, to be able to maintain well-being through work. And we need to be able to look at this in ways that rearrange and construct and retrofit workplaces, and perhaps think differently about what those workplaces are, as COVID and more distributed workplaces has already pointed us towards. So next slide, please. All of this means that there's huge complementarities between an adaptation from a worker perspective and adaptation from existing organisational approaches, sectoral approaches, regional approaches, and I should say even global approaches. There's a whole range of different initiatives that this could help to lever, as well as learn from and benefit from. We need to ensure that advocacy for changes here to enable adaptation outcomes, and I use that rather wordy phrasing intentionally because not all of this will be under the heading of climate change adaptation policy, climate change adaptation work. Sometimes it's about the adaptation or the adaptive outcomes that emerge from other areas. All of this needs to look at the enablers of adaptation, the enablers of good work too, which means that it's very much just a question for policy, regulation, etc., and looking at some of the aligned goals, including, of course, work on the transition to decarbonise society as well. And there's a range of research. We wouldn't be good researchers if we didn't identify a range of different research needs, including just the basic one of extending the empirical base on which this research is based by working with a greater array of unions, working with a greater array of workers, and also making sure that this work is longitudinal so that we can monitor changes over time, including reduced risks and impacts as adaptation kicks in. Next slide, please. And so finally, we offer forth some recommendations. These are informed by some of the recommendations provided through the survey by some of the workers themselves, most of which, is very much around this first thing of we need to really get going. We really need to crack on with the work of adaptation, including planning and action for workers, by workers, across a whole range of different levels and scales. That includes adapting occupational health and safety standards and practices, and workers were very clear about the kind of misfit that currently exists in some of the existing occupational health and safety spaces around this. In particular, we also need to address work arrangements and conditions to improve outcomes. So that's addressing those existing vulnerabilities, because they are only going to be exacerbated under climate change. They are going to cause and co-produce bad climate change impacts if not addressed. We need to advocate for wider action, education and training on both adaptation and mitigation. That sort of goes without saying. And again, it goes without saying that we need to continue to think hard about this, challenge some of the existing conceptualizations that have become a little bit rusted on in the adaptation field, and more than anything else, collect more information, more stories and more insights and ideas from those experiencing it on the front line, which is all workers, including ourselves. So with that, I would like to now hand over to two collaborators, two guests from two of the unions that participated here and helped us distribute the survey to their members. So I think, Anna, you're going to introduce them.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Fiona. Thanks, Lauren. I'm already reading the slide. So The first person I'd like to introduce is Fiona Mccandless from the Health and Community Services Union. So Fiona is a passionate unionist who works on HACSU's development team in member engagement and research. And over the last year, she's started and been growing a climate action group for members of HACSU. So I'll hand it over to Fiona, who's going to give us a bit of a zoomed in perspective on how climate impacts are affecting the health workers in her union.
Well, thanks for that introduction. It's always lovely to hear yourself introduced by someone else. So yes, I'm Fiona Mccandless from HACSU, the Health and Community Services Union. We're a specialist union for the disability, mental health and drug and alcohol services within Victoria, and lucky enough to take part in this survey. So again, like was mentioned, I'll just give a snapshot on some of the experiences our members have in times of extreme heat, particularly during the time of this survey. So our sectors are female-dominated essential workers who work with the most vulnerable in society. It's expected that our sectors will grow during times of sort of climate crisis because mental health impacts increase during heat waves, and things like pollution can create a society with more people with disability as well. The survey was at a really interesting time because it did compound with COVID. So our disability members in particular, as was mentioned by Lauren, experienced an additional compounding OH&S risk. So if there was a COVID outbreak in a community disability house, of course our workers had to wear full PPE. Now full PPE is the thick plastic gowns, gloves, N95 mask, goggles and face shield. And they had to care for the residents, the disabled clients as well. It was very difficult for us as a union to try to give proper direction over OH&S standards when we had these two compounding issues, particularly during the Australian summer. A lot of our members in disability reported having headaches, fogged up goggles, extreme thirst and sweating, having to wear the full PPE. And it's not as easy to just say, look, we need to take additional breaks or have more water. It takes 15 minutes to take off the PPE and 15 minutes to put it back on just to have a sip of water if you're going to do it correctly. So something that in the end, us as a union didn't have a full response to with these two influences. We had to take it on a case-by-case basis. We're expecting these sort of things to happen more in the future as well, particularly with the climate crisis increasing. One thing that our members did do in disability houses was up the air conditioning, which did make it cold for the residents who weren't in full PPE. Talking about heating and cooling houses, particularly disability houses, as was mentioned, a lot of our members who work in in-home support. So that's going to a resident's house, someone that has a disability and helping them with their daily tasks. Often if you're on disability pension or on the NDIS, you probably don't have enough money to ensure your house is 7-star rated, for energy efficiency. So a lot of our members working in clients' homes noted that there was insufficient heating and cooling in those homes. Talking about bushfires as well, so the very beginning of this survey. In the 2020 bushfires, it was quite difficult to go outside, and so residents' schedules were changed a lot during COVID and the bushfires. This caused a lot more occupational violence, so disabled clients hitting our members, and occupational violence rates increased during times of heat, and when schedules are changed. Health and community service workers are actually some of the most injured workers in Victoria, and we cost the most in work cover during these times. So it's definitely an impact that we're aware of, and that will increase, I suppose, particularly if there's bushfires and we can't go out of the house. One little thing I'll also mention, changes to the NDIS and funding for disability. We are noticing that respite houses are closing. These are specific disability houses that are used for incidental care. If someone's getting their house renovated for sort of holidays, or if a carer needs a break, then they can put their disabled child in a respite house for a short period of time. NDIS isn't funding these houses as they used to under block funding, so a lot of them are closing. In a time of a climate crisis, if there's a bushfire, we need specific disability houses for people that might be evacuating We used these houses a lot during COVID. It's one of the reasons why the disability sector didn't have an outbreak the same way as aged care did, for example. So we need to make sure that all systems are future thinking rather than just looking at funding sort of year by year as the NDIS does. To look over to mental health workers, so in 2021, there was a Perth study looking at the increases of inpatients within a Perth hospital. And they found in times of heat waves, the highest increase in inpatients for actually mental health department. Everyone thought it would be renal and heart inpatients, but actually mental health was by far the highest increase. Just a note here that respiratory increases weren't included in that study. I'm sure in times of bushfires, that would probably be a pretty big increase. But as I mentioned, mental health was the highest increase there. The Guardian newspaper also published an article recently stating that instances of online abuse, racial and gendered abuse, increased in times of heat waves too. So we've just had a Royal Commission into the mental health sector in Victoria, and the findings were that our mental health sector is in tatters and needs to be improved. With changing climate, especially increased heat, that's going to need even more focus because mental health is a big issue in times of heat. Also talking about bushfires, our members noted in the 2020 bushfires that we were noted an uptick in inpatients around the King Lake area. So people in King Lake area obviously were experienced the Black Saturday bushfires in 2009, but not so much in 2020. But trauma has a long memory. So the more we have sort of bushfires, mental health, people requiring mental health help across the state are going to increase as well. Particularly our members in Latrobe Valley, down at Latrobe Regional Health. I had a meeting with them down there, and they particularly noted that during the time of the survey, there was flooding in Latrobe, and they were very distressed about physically getting to work, the concern about getting back to their property, how would their property be after a day of work, having to come to work during COVID, and the stress of COVID, and again, of the flooding in this case. That's a very brief snapshot, and in conclusion, I'd like to thank Friends of the Earth and RMIT for this study. It has been wonderful to give our members a voice in this climate sort of talk. People don't often think about community service workers as being impacted by climate, and I think this survey has shown that we definitely are. Let's hope for net zero emissions by 2030. Thank you for the work there.
Thanks so much, Fiona. It's been so valuable to have HACSU participate in the survey and provide those on the ground experiences of health workers, particularly just after a time where I think, there's not been as big a societal awareness of what health workers have to go through on the front lines of a collective stressor like the pandemic in quite a long time. So I hope that kind of primes people for a stronger awareness of what they will also have to go through with climate disasters that are to come, and that, we can really use this research to make a case for better protection of those workers as part of our climate justice work. So thank you. And secondly, I'd like to introduce Colin Long, who is the Just Transitions organiser at the Victorian Trades Hall Council. He's also responsible for supporting Trades Hall's work on cooperatives, and that includes him being a founder and board member of Earthworker Cooperative and Cooperative Power Australia. Colin is going to talk about what the union movement has been doing more broadly to be a stronger voice for climate justice, which he's been driving a lot of really important work on. So over to you, Colin.
Thanks, Anna, and thank you for the great work that RMIT and Friends of the Earth have done, and the unions as well for this great survey work and some of the recommendations as well. Because I work for Trades Hall is a peak body, so we didn't directly participate in the survey. Our members are unions rather than union members. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about some broader issues that are often neglected, although not by this work, and are often neglected when we talk about climate change. And the importance of this research and this work, I think, is to put when it puts the world of work at the centre of climate change, it raises the issue of the regulation of work and the regulation of industrial relations. So for me and for trade unions more broadly, I think there is a really serious issue about the industrial relations framework and how that actually enables or restricts unions from taking action and helping workers to cope with the problems and the impacts of climate change. So I always argue that one of the most significant legislative elements that we need to deal with if we're going to deal with climate change is the Fair Work Act. And we've seen for a long time that the scourge of insecure work and inadequate wages has developed because of relentless attacks on unions over decades. And Australia now has one of the most repressive suite of anti-union laws in the OECD. And we always hear from the business lobby and their political representatives in Parliament calls for more so-called flexibility, which is really usually code for more power to bosses and more insecurity for workers. And that is, they use that call for flexibility, as I said, to increase our own power. And what we need to do as unions, and we're trying to do as unions, is to resist that increase of power to bosses. And that's not just because we want to increase wages or we want to increase employment security, but it's also not that resistance to that increase in boss power is for the sake of a transition to a sustainable economy. And the reason that is because improving the terms and conditions of workers is can be achieved by allowing workers to do their jobs, which is our job as unions is to collectivise the voices of workers and redress the power imbalance between them and their employers. So workers' rights are important in themselves, but making sure that industrial relations laws recognise and facilitate the important role of unions, not just workers' rights, but union rights is probably more so. There's a whole lot of ways that the current laws restrict the ability of workers to restrict the ability of unions to give workers a voice. And I would argue that workers need to have a voice and they need to have a real say in their workplaces and feel that their needs will be central to any sort of restructuring, including the restructuring that's going to be necessary to deal with climate change. And workers will be far more confident to engage in discussions around the climate transition if they feel they have a voice in it. So that means we have to really change the laws that give around collective bargaining, that give a lot more power to employers in that process. We have to remove the laws that restrict the kinds of issues that can be covered by collective agreements. We need to change the laws that make it incredibly hard for union members to take industrial action. We need to change the laws that prevent unions from taking solidarity action with other unions and other workers. And we need to change the laws that restrict union right of entry into workplaces to speak to workers or inspect conditions. So all of those things are necessary if we're really to give workers a proper voice to give them a proper voice and confidence that in a transition of the scale that we need to undergo to deal with climate change, that workers will be listened to.
Thanks,
I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, Thanks so much, Colin. There's so many important avenues that you've opened up there, and I really appreciate the way that broadens out the concept of adaptation away from sort of direct weather-related protections, if you like. So I'm going to jump in here, given the time, and throw to our Q&A, where we've had some great questions coming through. First of all, just a quick response on the union question. So Anna, you would have seen this question just about some of the unions not involved, and I think the answer is we hope they will become involved soon. And also what steps the unions will be taking. So maybe just a very quick snippet from you, Anna, and then if Fiona or Colin want to quickly answer the question on what to do next, and then we'll jump to the larger question about policy.
I'm sorry, I might actually need to throw to someone else, or someone can read me it, because I dropped out of the meeting before for some reason, and the chat had updated for me.
No worries. It's just a question about why the AEU are not involved, and we could say the same about NTEU and a whole range of different unions. So just the quick, how did we come up with these 6? Or where did they?
Yeah, I think so originally we reached out to quite a big range of unions, and I think for a lot of the ones we reached out to, it was just a capacity issue at the time, in terms of what kind of extra communications they had space to put out to members. So yeah, I think we really it will be super important to continue this kind of research with a much broader range of all unions that want to participate in it. I'm really excited to see where we can take that. So yeah, I guess what we were aiming for with the selection that we ended up with was really showing that diversity of workplaces that have been, I guess, not the kind of narrower range traditionally focused on when it comes to workers and climate. So we had that mix of transport workers, health workers, people in offices, people in kitchens, just for this real early pioneering kind of study on it to get that diversity.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is just a toe in the water, and we're hoping to expand. Fiona or Colin, did you want to make a quick comment about what you're thinking of doing, next steps? And obviously it might be go away and think and discuss, but have you given it some thought? Fiona, first to you.
Jump in first, yes. So I see there is a question about political and policy for climate disaster leave. That is a clause we've actually got into one of our largest EBA recently, our public mental health EBA. As Colin mentioned, it's quite difficult to get climate-related clauses into the EBA. It's actually outlawed. An EBA has to be about the relationship between the employee and the employer. What we've got into our public mental health EBA is that you're allowed to take time off for SES or CFA leave, and that's additional to any other sort of type of leave. Also, if you or your property is in danger of a climate disaster, be it flood or bushfire, you can take, and I believe, don't quote me on this, I believe it's 3 days off a year for those reasons, or if someone in your family needs assistance there. So it's a start, but we have got that into an agreement.
Thank you. Colin?
Yeah, we're doing quite a lot at Victorian Trades Hall. We are encouraging all unions to establish their own climate action committees, and Fiona's doing a great work there at HACSU, and a number of unions have established such committees to get members involved in climate related activities. We coordinate that at a state level as well, and then we feed that up into the national level through the ACTU. We're running our own conference on Friday about union demands for a just transition, and it's hitting climate change targets. What do we actually need to do? We run training with the ACTU for union members, delegates, activists, anyone. I think the next one's coming up at the end of September. We also tailor training for particular unions to their particular industries, for instance, around climate action. And there's a whole number of other things that probably don't have time to go into.
Great, thank you so much. And just maybe if I'll just sort of touch on a couple of the other comments that have been raised here in terms of what we're sort of hoping to do. So we're going to actually be giving a briefing on this to the Victorian Government. We've got a ministerial briefing being attended by Minister D'Ambrosio, among others, which sadly was delayed from today due to the need to swear allegiance to the King. I shouldn't say need, should I? The choice. And we are going to be working to talk to a range of others across industries, across all sorts of different elements of this, looking at ways in which this sort of work can be used to progress appropriately comprehensive, appropriately human-centred approaches to adaptation. We are looking to extend this research. As we said, this is just a toe in the water, and we'd encourage you to reach out if you are interested in that. We're looking at more surveys, but we're also looking at other methods as well, really trying to gather together these stories so that we can start to understand it, unpack it. And you'll be pleased to know that we're also taking careful note of universities as workplaces and academics of various sorts and professional workers in universities as workers as well, and thinking through what adaptation of work looks like given the complexity of work in that space. So using it as that sort of living lab, as I said. So sadly we're out of time, but thank you everybody, both our presenters, Fiona, Colin, Alan, Anna and Todd, as well as Jenny, Lucy and others behind the scenes. Thank you to all who've attended today to actually make it an event, and we really look forward to progressing this conversation with you. So thank you, and hopefully we'll be in touch. Thanks everybody.